you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, and even relatives. There are a number of relatives here tonight as well. I would like first to thank Professor Bennett for his kind invitation to come here and just summarize some of the results of our research at Lefkandi. So my lecture tonight is on the period of significant change that took place at the end of the Palatial era in late Bronze Age Greece. The title, as you have heard, is inspired by the well-known ballad by the 2016 winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, Bob Dylan, whose lyrics may sound as relevant today as perhaps in the past we excavators in truth. The second part of my title is inspired by the work of our Vice Chairman, Professor Robin Osborne, who is here tonight, and who was one of the earliest ancient historians to study the 12th century BC. Tonight, I would like to suggest that changes after the so-called palatial collapse had affected the social and cultural lives of the communities that survived it. I guess for most of you it's not news, but I would like to argue that during this period, communities were forced to take decisions that transformed them in several ways. These changes, however, did not happen overnight, and some of their outcomes might have taken a while to become visible, particularly in the archaeological record. Moreover, it's interesting to know that while there are a lot of debates based on various theoretical models as to how the Mycenaean state evolved from the Middle Helladic background, and it's enough here to mention the pioneer work of Jim Wright and Sofia Voutsaki, and at the other end, while there is much of scholarly interest focusing on the process that led to the making of the archaic city or the polis, not much attention has been paid to the period in between. Indeed, in the past, the lack of archaeological remains has often discouraged the study of the period that covers some 400 years of the archaeological record of Greece, roughly from the 12th to the end of the 9th centuries BC. In sum, on the one hand, there is lack of archaeologically visible material to please the eyes of the ancient historians. On the other hand, there is not much for the palate of the overindulged from too much evidence late Bronze Age archaeologists, and that hampers the study of what lies in between two galaxies of research. So tonight, I would like to focus mostly on the century after the so-called collapse, and this is the 12th century BC. And I wish to do that because of the most recent discoveries made on Xeropolis at Lefkandi, and that mostly belong actually to the 12th century. And those of you who do not know where Lefkandi is, if you dare to say that, it's the site between Eretria and Chalkida. Actually, the discoveries at Lefkandi urged me to reevaluate the importance of the 12th century. Thankfully, the period is gradually getting more attention from archaeologists working in Greece, and indeed, we have started to digest new and old discoveries, which for me, as already mentioned, mark the beginning of the making of early Greece. One of the major changes in the 12th century is the rejection of the palace system. The most significant manifestation of such rejection is that we don't have any more palaces. Whatever the reason that palatial buildings in Mycenae, Tiryns, and elsewhere were destroyed, the fact was that such complex citadels were never rebuilt, even if some were modified and partly reused after the collapse. Interestingly, scholars such as Maran and Wright and their students have advocated the importance of how monumental architecture is embedded in the cultural space of those who shaped and maintained its preservation. If so, the loss of monumentalization would have had lasting effects on the descendants of the Mycenaean past. This is well manifested at Athens, where significant changes signal transformations in the use and the materiality of the space. Indeed, early excavations by Klaus Killiam and more recent by Joseph Maran and his team have shown that important changes took place in the lower citadel after the archaeological horizon that marks the end of the palatial period with a vast destruction. We can all see in these plans that the earlier corridor-type houses were discarded and buildings with different architectural plans were erected, some with elaborated features and even second floors. During the same period, the upper citadel was not abandoned, but the so-called Antebau occupied the eastern part of the Mycenaean Megaron. Killian suggested that this structure, also known as Building T, was deliberately aligned with the Megaron's eastern wall in order to incorporate the area where the Mycenaean throne was in the past. However, the function of the building was now different. It has been suggested that Building T served as a meeting hall for the elite members who were in charge of the site, but who were no longer living in the upper citadel. Who those people were is not clear, but they could have been officials who survived the end of the palatial system and chose to use the materiality of the seat of the palatial power, amend it and transform in order to serve their own agenda. Equally important is the construction of buildings in the lower town. To the southeast of the citadel, Megaron W was a large building with 3 inner columns and a hearth. More buildings were discovered by Maran in the northeast of the citadel. Interestingly, it is mostly in the northeast lower town that Cretan and especially Cypriot imports were discovered. It has even been suggested that there might have been individuals from Cyprus residing in this part of the lower town. This is, of course, important, not only because it is clear that contacts with the islands continued during this post-palatial period, but in my view, because their discovery in these particular buildings suggests that such exchanges were in the hands of those who chose to reside in the lower town and create a habitus away from the citadel. So there are significant transformations in the use of space in post-palatial Tiryns. During the 12th century, changing patterns in the energy of space can be also observed on Xeropolis Lefkandi. Xeropolis was founded at least in the early Bronze Age, if not earlier, and was very important in the Middle Helladic period. This is an aerial photograph taken in the 1960s when Saket and Popam were excavated on Xeropolis, and just next to the aerial photograph I just put all the possible names that belong perhaps to the ancient site of Lefkandi, just to remind people that Lefkandi, of course, it's not the ancient name of the site. At present, the late Helladic 3B period, for those of you who are not aware of late Helladic 3B, it's the palatial period, the Mycenaean period, is not well presented on the tell, but this might change with future research. It is also the case that so far we have not discovered any late Bronze Age palace close by to Lefkandi or elsewhere on the island of Euboia. Instead, it has been generally argued, but not entirely agreed, that the island had close links with the palace at Thebes. Linear B documents from Thebes reveal the contribution that the island made to provisions of banquets organized by the palace. Nodules and one tablet refer to the toponyms Amaruto and Karuto, which have been identified with the sites of Amarinthus and Charistos respectively. In particular, on the occasion of a banquet, a man called Kerigo from Amaruto sent a pig to the palace. The toponym appears again on a tablet that records that wool was allocated to various individuals, including someone again from Amarinthos. On another nodule, the toponym Karuto has been identified with Charistos, from where a pig was offered, most probably for another ceremonial feast. If the toponyms recorded in the tablets were on Euboia, such participation in the ceremonial banquets indicates special relationship between the palace and the island. Indeed, it has been argued that the participation in feasting implies stronger relations than just those of administrative dependence. They could also suggest close cultural ties via status and even family connections. I believe that links between Euboean themes were not only likely, but essential because of the particular geographical relationship between the two regions. In any case, new research has suggested that although territorial authorities, at least in Messenia, between the Palace of Pylos and its provinces were not tight, they were much needed. So there was perhaps a similar relation between Euboea and the palace at Thebes. But in any case, what is clear is that after the 1200 events and the destruction of the palace in Thebes, Xeropolis enjoys, together with other sites located along the Euboean Gulf, one of their most prolific periods in their archaeological histories. Indeed, Xeropolis must have been one of the largest sites in central Greece, occupying an area of around 10 hectares or even more if one takes into consideration the dramatic erosion of the tell, especially from the side of the sea. Moreover, the present picture we have from Xeropolis in the 12th century is that the whole tell was occupied. So you can see here the excavation, the sites we have excavated, but also all these trial trenches dug by Popham and Sackett, and in all of those we have 12th century material. Organizational space was without doubt an important agency that articulated the social and cultural identities of the people who occupied the tell at any time. I could go on discussing the significance on living on Xeropolis for generations, but it is important to note here that such practice might be linked with concepts of memory related with the continuous use of the same landscape. But now it's time to show you one of the most important discoveries made on Xeropolis during the recent excavations under my direction. This is the discovery of a big building, and it is significant because the plan and orientation of the buildings differ from earlier and contemporary structures. This large building was discovered by the Eastern Harbor and could have been the dwelling of the local ruler or of that of a member of the elite. The other alternative is that it might have served a similar function as that of building T at Tiryns. In that, it was the communal space where members of the elite could meet in special occasions. However, this remains at present a speculation. The detailed study of its stratigraphy and ceramics is almost completed, so I can offer you today some preliminary observations and more precise dating of its construction and different phases. So during roughly the 1190 BC, at the end of late Helladic 3C early, the mud brick walls of a house with an orientation of the excavation grid were demolished. Here in the aerial photograph, this house is marked in red. And as you can see, without doubt, has a different orientation and plan from its predecessors. So this first long building that I call here for convenience Megaron 1 had at least two phases of occupation and went out of use sometime by the end of the late Helladic 3C middle, let's say roughly about 1140 BC. So you can see the first phase of Megaron 1, an additional room to northeast of it belonged to this Megaron and was found to contain many vessels for storage and preparation of food. During the last phase of the occupation of Megaron 1, another room, which we call the annex, was added to the east, and this was used when the northeast room went out of use and also continued to be occupied in later phases. The preserved dimensions of the building are roughly 10 by 6 meters. The northeast room is roughly 5.60 to 2.5 meters in dimensions. And you can see here in AutoCAD reconstructions the two different phases of Megaron 1. After leveling the area above Megaron 1, another building was erected on the top of it. This building I call here for convenience Megaron 2, and it had at least 3 phases of occupation. The preserved dimensions of the Megaron 2 is 8.5 by 6.5 meters. I would like to note here that much of the north end of the building, both buildings 1 and 2, are lost by the construction of an Iron Age apsidal house, as you can see here on the aerial photograph, and the erosion at the edge of the tell at this point. So we don't really know their precise size. However, what is significant is that this second building, Megaron 2, belongs to what we have thought was the darkest period in the Aegean. This period covers the end of the late Helladic 3C, this is the very end of the 12th century, and the so-called Sub-Mycenaean period in the early 11th century BC. In fact, we don't know many buildings dated to this period from other sites. Finally, the last phase of the Megaron marks the beginning of the early Iron Age, while we have evidence of the use of the area in the geometric period, noticeably with the cut of a large pit that you can see here in yellow, and the appearance of walls which might belong to structures of the 8th century BC. A special piece of furniture is associated with the earlier building, Megaron 1. This complex hearth was discovered at the north end of the building. It is this feature that makes me think that the building might have had a special function. This needs, of course, more research to adopt this kind of idea. But the so-called hearth was equipped with box-like features, you can see some of them here, and some other like ball mud brick features, and of course it was covered with quite a lot of burnt soils. We found quite a lot of burnt soils around this excavated area. Interestingly, in front of it, in front of the so-called hearth, and in a context related with one of the floors of the Megaron 1, this magnificent stirrup jar was found, almost complete, but with some of its fragments scattered in the area around the Megaron. Octopus stirrup jars are commonly found in the period, but mostly in funerary contexts. This is, however, not a local pot. It was not made at Lefkandi. The decoration, which you can see here in a reconstruction, is exceptional. For example, notice how the octopus tentacles are drawn vertically rather than across the belly of the pot, as it is usually the case. Here you see an octopus jar from Naxos, and you can see exactly what I am describing here. The tentacles of our octopus is all vertical, while these ones cover, the body of the pot. Also, please note how splendid is the application of the detailed close-style decoration on this particular pot. This is a work of an inspirational, in my view, post-palatial craftsman of the 12th century, and designed, in my view, to be given as a special gift to the occupants of the building. However, this is not the only vessel that is decorated in the pictorial style. A number of vases with pictorial decorations have been added to the already well-known corpus from Xeropolis, published by Crowell and discussed in various occasions by many scholars. Indeed, an important aspect of the 12th century, and especially from the middle of this century and later, is the production and consumption of ceramics decorated in the so-called pictorial style. The style is used to decorate mostly craters. It has already been commented how the shape and the surface of such open pots invite the depiction of iconographical scenes. It has also been argued, and I agree with this, that craters are clearly used for communal eating and drinking. And you can see here one of the most famous examples of those craters from Mycenae. Some of these craters are of large dimensions, 35 or more centimeters in diameter, and they were clearly used in social gatherings. Jerry Rutter has noted that most of the already published pieces from Xeropolis lack contextual information to help us to understand aspects of their use. However, I would like to comment that first, they all come from the settlement, and that their large number, some 150 fragments or more known so far, do suggest that they were widely used. Finally, more recently, it has also been argued how the decoration of these vases exercised an agency upon their users and exposed meaningful principles of their beliefs and agendas. More simply, the agency of both their decoration and shape reflect important social and cultural practices. Lefkandi is not the only site that has produced such vases. They are also found in a large number elsewhere. We saw the one of Mycenae. We have a lot of Tyrins and very many other places. Some of the imaginary is common, such as warriors, animals, the octopuses that we have already mentioned, and important for the cultural koine in operation in the Euboian Gulf, the depiction of ships. And again, we noticed that there are a lot of craters decorated with such imaginary. The importance of ships depicted on some of the craters have been commented on by many scholars, together with the suggestion that appropriate infrastructure to both maintain and manage them was in operation. This is because for such galleys to sail, it's necessary to recruit a crew of at least 20 oarsmen for the small ones, while up to 50 were required for the larger ships. The ceramics recovered from the Megaron on Xeropolis, however, include a lot of other wares, and most importantly, quite a lot of vessels for storage. It is remarkable that long storage was important on Xeropolis. The same picture emerged from other sites. For example, closer home, the very important sites of Mitru, Kinos, and Eleon have been equipped with storage facilities. We can appreciate that storage was necessary for the communities of the 12th century. Moreover, it has been noted that, for example, during the late Bronze Age Nichoria in Messenia, there is poor evidence of vessels used for extensive storage, such as, for example, pithoi. Nichoria, according to John Bennett, was most probably a second-order settlement in the Palatial period. However, in the early Iron Age, the site was equipped with storage facilities. So, in Nichoria, in the early Iron Age, as at Lefkandi, already from the 12th century, there was clearly a policy of the provision of substantial storage for the self-sufficiency of each household. Moreover, at Lefkandi, the analysis of archaeobotanical remains and the archaeological studies confirmed that the socio-economy of these households relied on management strategies. The preliminary identification of the sorted material and the overall study of the archaeobotanical remains by Alexandra Livarda and Georgia Kodjamani suggests the presence of a wide variety of plant species. The species include different types of wheat, hull barley, millet, lentil, vetches, fig, grape, olive, and numerous wild species. According to our specialists, the picture which emerges is that of a community with a complex agricultural strategy that engages in the cultivation of a great variety of species. A recent complete thesis on the faunal remains from Xeropolis suggests a multifaceted model of animal social economy at the site. Mueller's research results show the presence and the management of specific species and their exploitation strategies. Moreover, his studies reveal the significance of social values added to animals and their products. In sum, the results of his research support a mixed economy model that combines the interaction between microeconomies and their ecological environs. Finally, this important study clearly rejects earlier assumptions of a shift to pastoralism in the 12th century. When the above studies are fully completely, it will be important to compare them with others from sites located in the Euboean Gulf and elsewhere. This will allow us to address questions regarding the modes of their economies based on agricultural and animal husbandry, as well as aspects of their diet and environmental settings. These studies are, of course, necessary for a better understanding of what has changed after the palaces ceased to regulate any local or regional resources. In any case, the present evidence suggests that on Xeropolis, households, as elsewhere, played an important role in the economies that started to articulate in the 12th century. The so far excavated houses are large, and most of them had courtyards. They may even have had a second floor. Alleys and streets divided the excavated households, showing that space was well managed and allocated. And as we have already noted, these houses were equipped with storage facilities and good quality tableware, some of which were decorated with iconographical scenes. Another important discovery made in the recent excavation is that of a wall located at the entrance of the site, in region 2. We excavated in the middle of the tell a late Helladic 3C, in other words 12th century wall, running from west to east, marking the approach to the settlement. These constructions involve complex design and landscaping. A richer area, lying west of the wall, was occupied by structures whose character is neither domestic nor funerary. They enclose clay drums and circular structures of stones and have been compared with similar circular stones platforms from Naxos, Assini, and Troy, which date from the 10th to the 7th centuries. Those at Lefkandi are much earlier and date from the late Helladic 3C to the transition from the Sub-Mycenaean to the Proto-Geometric period. These structures were open without evidence found to suggest any roofing. They were found associated with large open vessels and cooking pots, suggesting communal feasting, while figurines were also discovered nearby. The study of this part of the excavation is still in progress, but interestingly, the ceramics associated with the structures are not of any exceptional character, but they are noticeable in size. They include large cooking and huge craters. It is their simply functional character in association with the discovery of bones that suggested to me that this area was dedicated to communal dining and feasting. Further excavation may show that there were more such structures located at this particular area on Xeropolis. Indeed, it is possible that there was more than one of these rectangular structures, as you can see here in this AutoCAD reconstruction. One of my current ideas is that each one of them might have belonged to different households that participated in communal dining at the entrance of the settlement. Clearly, such communal occasions were designed to promote the new identities that began to be shaped on the tell from the 12th century. If my assumption is correct, it's interesting that communal feasting at the limits of the living space combined collective and private aspects of celebrations. It was like a cyclopedia, I suppose, taking place there, as it is today. Next, it might be interesting to ask who was in charge of such a large site as Lefkandi. Indeed, in the early part of the 12th century, it might have been palatial officials, as in Thebes. I may even suggest that some officials from Thebes moved to the island after the palatial collapse, bringing with them their expertise and, most importantly, their acquaintance with contacts with the Eastern and Central Mediterranean. Such interactions not only survived into the 12th century, but as we know, they thrived, especially in the early Iron Age at Lefkandi. Nonetheless, roughly 1 or 2 generations after the palatial collapse, their agency must have changed. It is possible that by the middle to the end of the century, local chiefs were in charge. Such men endorsed military prowess, were engaged in the tenure arrangements of the various households, kept the whole of the site in good conditions, and finally maintained connectivity with regional and interregional polities. The iconography on the craters and on other vases provides some hints of the qualities promoted and commissioned by such leaders and their followers. It has been argued that some maintain reference with the palatial past, as indicated by the depiction of the chariot scenes that recall Mycenaean practices. But there are some interesting exceptions. For example, Jerry Radis noticed that on the pictorial style found on Xeropolis, there was an interest in depicting scenes related to parents and their young. And he's right. The scenes include mostly animals. The most well-known, without doubt, is the alabastron decorated with the griffins feeding their young in the nest. And of course, the crater with the sphinx and her baby sphinx under her. Rutter noted the significance of depicting in such scenes, in particular, lions, sphinxes, and even griffins. These images were often employed in the palatial past as symbols of power and authority. I agree that such choices are significant and that indeed the local artist was employed to portray with a combination of humor but also mockery what were indeed in the past emblems associated with palatial agency. Well, if these are indeed satirical images, we have here some early examples of making fun in public of former authority. In any case, there was clearly interplay of manipulation but also of parody of the past. However, we don't know whether by the middle of the 12th century or later was the site in the hands of elite households or eventually under one chief. But that such change did happen, it is in my view clear, because in the middle of the 10th century, an exceptional funeral took place on an extraordinary local man. As we know, he was given the most amazing funeral so far known from early Iron Age in Greece and beyond. After his burial, more amazing funerals took place at the Toumba cemetery, highlighting the wealth of elite households whose members clearly compete in the funerary display. So even if there was some sort of basileus in charge of the site, his power was supported and, in my view, perhaps even replaced by members of the local elite who were buried in the Toumba cemetery after him. Their burial rites reflect complex social structures resembling those of chiefdoms, that while supporting hierarchical structures and lifestyles, could be also unstable and characterized by internal competition and strife. Indeed, that might have been one of the reasons Lefkandi was eventually abandoned. Present evidence suggests that the rich cemeteries at Lefkandi ceased to receive burials towards the end of the 9th century. Their abandonment might imply that some of the elite members left Lefkandi and moved elsewhere. Some might have been relocated to the nearby Eretria that started to develop into a prominent site. Others might have gone abroad to places where links and contacts were already both well established and exploited by local elites there, places in the central Mediterranean or even the northern Aegean. But it is in Eretria that the next stage of social structures based on households began to advance. Indeed, past discoveries in the nearby Eretria inspired scholars to trace the genesis of the polis, the city-states there. More recently, meticulous scholarship by my Swiss colleagues re-evaluated not only the earlier and recent archaeological evidence, but also its interpretation, especially in connection with the emergence of institutions and practices that could be associated with those of the polis. Nonetheless, I would like to argue that even if the archaeological picture of early 8th century Eretria reveals fragmented households occupying the plain and its coastline, later in the century, the crystallization of cult practices, the division of the space of the living and the dead, and finally, the collective decision to build a wall should be considered as early signs of the coming together of the Eretrian community. But these are already features that we have already documented in the 12th century Lefkandi. And it is for this reason that I suggest that at Lefkandi we can trace the birth of significant transformations that we do mostly associate with the microstates of the early Iron Age. In conclusion, the archaeology of Lefkandi and Euboia in general offers the opportunity to trace continuities from the late Bronze to the early Iron Age, and at the same time to extract the beginning of distinctive developments appearing after the reject of the palatial system. The site of Lefkandi in particular offers evidence of uninterrupted traditions in the construction of imposing buildings, the manifestation of rites, advertising local agendas, and the production and consumption of iconographical things that display both connections and rejection of the past. Such features will be advanced further in the next phase, where the tradition of imposing buildings and ritual practices in the funeral arena have been associated with one of the most resourceful communities of early Greece. Such important traditions cannot be ignored and can explain the attainment that the island enjoyed in the late Bronze and early Iron Age, and the important contribution it offers to study social and cultural responses after the years of crisis. Thank you very much.